Okay, so I'd probably like to say a couple of things. I think I've got about 7 points that I wanted to make, and I'll make them as quickly as I can. The first thing is that what we're talking about is not unique to Australia, but the elements of it are unique to Australia. Much of this is common across many OECD nations and Western democracies. There is a shift to the right over the last couple of decades, and this notion of entitlement of customers, which we might call citizens, is a common discourse from a particularly lopsided discourse, I might add. And for those who were here last night and heard the wit and wisdom of the former judge, I think there is much to be learnt from some of his comments. This notion of leaners and lifters, I mean, that was Joe Hockey channeling Bob Menzies from a speech in 1942. The difference was in 1942, Bob Menzies was looking forward. He was looking to a future Australia. And by channeling Menzies in 2014, I suspect Hockey was looking backwards to a wonderful utopian society that didn't actually exist. The key issue for anyone who is involved in social housing, housing issues, homelessness issues, is ultimately about jobs and the robbery of aspiration. And what society and what governments do to the poor is we rob them of aspiration, and we fundamentally damage them and their children. I'll make a couple of comments about that. The hollowing out of the discourse, I can't recall, I think it was Eva mentioned about the discourse, public discourse. It's been hollowed out in this nation, and I just want to commend the organisers for putting this kind of conversation together, because it is all too rare. And we know that our discourse in our communities have been hollowed out for a lack of opinions and perspectives that are not purely economic, and I think Warwick has restored the faith of some of us in some economists. Thank you for that. I want to talk to you just very briefly about a little fellow who was a tenant of mine. His name was Liam Sandvik. He was the child of a Norwegian who moved to Australia for a better life, which seems hardly imaginable in this day and age.
Hadn't read rules.
And hadn't read rules. Liam had a profound mental illness. He had moments of clarity and brilliance. He felt deeply guilty that he had been born with a mental illness. And we housed him. And he was a follower of this thing we call a public discourse. He read the newspapers. He listened to the local ABC radio. He was kind of switched on when he wasn't in the depths of the demons that he sometimes fell party to when he didn't keep his medication up. And he felt deeply guilty about living in social housing, the product of a migrant who came here for a better life. He felt deeply guilty about being on a disability support pension. He wanted to contribute. And on the 27th of June last year, he rode his push bike out to Spring Gully and walked into the forest and hung himself because he was guilty about being a leaner. 27-year-old boy who wanted to contribute, who hung himself because he felt his government had called him a leaner. Words are powerful, and disparaging terms like lifters and leaners add nothing to the discourse, and we should always be careful about that. So Homo economicus, as Eva Cox has named our new tribe, is deeply disturbing because of its focus on purely economic issues. We cannot grow a great society out of an impoverished one, and growing small business is important, but at a time when the rest of the world is seeing economic growth coming from major and mammoth companies that are now global in reach, and we choose to leave them alone while we chase the welfare recipient for ever increasing productivity savings, seems to me to be completely wrong-headed. So we have a choice about who we leave behind in our society, and the choices we're making are deeply disturbing. And they come down to local issues, and I think some of the things we've seen from a hollowing out of discourse is a hollowing out of public policy, and when you have a hollowing out of public policy, you have a hollowing out of public provision, and you only need to walk through any public school, and we've got some fabulous ones in Bendigo that have been built recently and quite newly, and we see these great infrastructure projects delivered by the state. But when you walk into them, there's no new teachers, there's no new books, there's no new technology, and there's no money to run them at what their capacity could be. Yet at the same time today we have one of Australia's most exclusive private schools asking their alumni for $25,000 each over 5 years so they can raise the equality of their female students. That's a great bastardisation of the word equality, I might add. So the underpinnings of the economy, I'll just briefly come back to, but going back to that shift to the right, we see this shift to the right not only across Western democracies, not only in our nation, not only in our public discourse, but we see it being reflected in the angst and the anger of those left behind. And those left behind are often those with the most limited skills, the most limited education, the very people our public education and health systems are probably there to help. And as we witness the growth in technology, as we witness the greatest change in history through the use of particularly the internet and social media, we also witness the rise of groups who express their anger at looking for an other to target. So the Reclaim Australia rallies are probably a good example of that when you look at who sits behind those groups, the neo-Nazis, the haters. Yet they are gaining prominence because we have allowed in our public discourse the targeting of the other. And every time we target from the highest office in the land, the leaners, we are simply setting up permission for more people to be targeted and left behind, and that disturbs me. So can I just say I was greatly pleased to hear Warwick mention the term fiscal policy without then shooting it down. It's the first time I've heard that for some time, Warwick. Well done you. Sadly, I think the Keynesians have been left behind and the monetarists have won, and may Friedrich Hayek rot in hell for that. But where are the visions for the infrastructure and the capacity building of a nation that Menzies did in fact talk about way back in 1942 in very dark times? We're not in dark times, we are in the greatest time in history as Australians in this nation. Yet we continue to leave people behind and we have no plan for our infrastructure. When governments can borrow at the cheapest rates in living memory, and beyond my living memory I might add, we continue to talk about public-private partnerships that simply transfer the public's wealth into the hands of shareholders. That disturbs me, this lack of vision. And so the risks that Warwick points out with the TPP and various other FTAs, we blindly, I suspect, perhaps not people in this room, but the public discourse blindly follows governments as we pursue the growth in profits for these globalised massive banks and companies, at the same time as we allow what I sometimes refer to as the prophylactic institutions to be dismantled. And we only have to look at the small and large institutions that have been disemboweled, gutted, and in some cases toned right down in terms of their capacity. Those who would govern and manage and moderate the excesses that brought us the global financial crisis in the first place. And we are disemboweling and destroying those prophylactic institutions. I use the word prophylactic institution to describe ASIC and APRA and all of those other regulatory bodies because they don't seem to do much unless something goes off. So sadly they are also being eroded, and they are our protections for when the next GFC or something worse hits. So I think there is much grist to the mill that has been covered here so far.